Hello, and welcome back to Living a Culture of Life podcast by Human Life International. I'm your host, Colleen, and I'm very excited to have you join us today. On today's episode, Father Shenan Boquet and I discuss the demographic winter that China is currently experiencing. As you probably know, for decades, China enforced its infamous one-child policy, using methods like forced sterilization and abortion to ensure that couples only had one child. Well, as you can imagine, China is now facing a birth rate crisis, similar to what's going on in the rest of the world. And it is desperately trying to reverse this crisis by incentivizing couples to welcome more children. So Father and I discussed this entire situation, how China got here, what they're trying to do to fix this crisis. And then we discussed the common mistakes that governments like the United States and China run into when trying to increase the birth rates in their countries. It's a great conversation. I really hope that you enjoy it. As always, if you're listening on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or any of our audio platforms, please pause right now and leave us a 5-star review and subscribe to the show. And if you're listening on our YouTube channel, please like this video and subscribe to our channel so that you can get new episodes every Thursday. Without further ado, please welcome Father Boquet to Living a Culture of Life. Welcome to the podcast, Father.
Well, Colleen, always great to be with you.
It's great to have you here in the studio again and to be discussing a topic that I think is really interesting, and that is China's birth rate crisis and what they're trying to do to fix it. And growing up in the pro-life movement, I heard basically my entire life about China's one-child policy. So it's really interesting to see them kind of change their tune on this topic and see China start to realize the problems with that policy. So to jump into today's topic, could you first talk about what China is doing to try to fix the birth rate crisis? And we can talk a little bit about what led them to this point.
Right. So just to again, put things back in context for our listeners. So we have to go back to the probably mid to late 1960s. Mm-hmm. And of course, people are quite familiar with Paul Ehrlich's book, Population Bomb, and so what happened with that period was just people began to be concerned, about if these things could be possible. Could there be enough food? Would there be enough resource? And of course, that language, like anything, Colleen, can be manipulated to one's ideology. Mm-hmm. And so what we saw in many parts of the world, like in China, was taking advantage of that, reality, their so-called reality, what people were professing, believing, and how did it apply to their own way of envisioning their country. Mm-hmm. And as a result, they implemented an aggressive population control policy that eventually would become known as the one-child policy. But basically what it did is it just started restricting families, from welcoming children, and to the point of regulating and actually creating a culture where people would report on each other, neighbor would report on neighbor. So basically just through the strong-arming people into this mindset that now today has become a culture within a culture. And so as we see in many parts of the world where the demographic numbers are going down, low birth rates are affecting societies across the planet because of these policies and these ideologies that have become entrenched in state policy and healthcare and so forth, and the way we approach marriage in society. That these are the outcomes. And I really believe that they could not see this. You would think people of great intelligence could see the possibilities, the foreseeable outcomes. What would happen, if these things really become so entrenched that we might see ourselves 30, 50, 60, 70 years later in a demographic problem because our measures have been so successful.
Well, it seemed like, from my understanding, there was so much fear-mongering over what is going to happen with overpopulation. People are going to starve, that it was really seen as this impending threat, and the only way to fix it was to reduce the population. So I guess it sort of makes sense that if that's the propaganda, the messaging that you're being inundated with, you would take extreme measures to confront it. But obviously, like you said, they're now waking up and realizing that this is actually creating problems of the opposite.
And it works, obviously for the Chinese government's mindset, it works to their political advantage too, because it's another control mechanism. It's another way of forcing not only a mindset, but a way of life and a control that the government has on every aspect of society. And so as a result, that's what's happening today. And so now the demographers are showing what's happening, since probably the mid-2000s, 2016, is that, all of a sudden you start hearing now China is considering changing its approach. Why? Because low birth rates are now beginning to be seen, and the outcomes about how this is going to affect their GDP, how is it going to affect society, how is it going to protect its ability to be a power, in the global market. All these things are now coming to the forefront, and it's scaring those in leadership, as it's doing in many other parts of the world. And I know we're going to get to some of that. But as a result, what China did is it started to lessen the restriction. And so what you would see is vouchers being given. Now, I want you to pause for a moment, Colleen, and for our listeners, to understand why the church, in her great wisdom, has always denounced such practices. So I just mentioned the word voucher. Imagine a government coming to you, a newly married woman, and saying to you and your husband, you are only allowed one child, but we'll give you a voucher maybe for 2 children. So the government is literally controlling, how many children a family might welcome. And, and also by whether it be through incentivizing, through a voucher system. If you happen to be out in the farming community, we'll give you an extra voucher. It's government controlling. So this is not about the free expression of love between husband and wife and the beautiful unitive and procreative understanding and the inseparability. No, we have still very much a contraceptive mandate, that's still being, implemented by saying you only can have 1 or 2, and then later we saw 3, but government is still involved. Government is no longer the one manipulating, exploiting, powerhousing, strong-arming. This is not marriage. This is not family life. This is not an openness to human life. This is not a respect for human life. A child here, again, is being treated like a commodity, a property that we can either welcome or discard, or someone can give a voucher like going to a vending machine. Okay, you have permission now. So that's why I've written on this several times, is that, the Chinese government, like many other governments around the world, could never have envisioned what subculture they would create. And now the incentivization that they're offering, and we're going to talk about IVF, but separately from IVF, which is the method by which this would occur in many ways, is the idea that it's not working. As I note in one of my recent articles about Hungary, who is very pro-life and really trying to incentivize, but all that they're doing, it's making an impact, but it's very, very little, very slow. We commend them and we want to see this continue. But the idea is that, this is not what's going to change. We're back to the mindset. We're back to how do you unravel a culture that you've created in that mindset.
So basically in the past 20 something years, China has gone from forcing families to only welcome 1 child. And I believe they did that through abortion, sterilization, things like that. So you have them going from telling them that telling parents that they can only welcome 1 child to offering them vouchers and having incentives for them to welcome more than 1 child?
Exactly. But if I can just really emphasize that forced sterilizations, forced abortion, and if you had permission for 1 child, and let's say that you happen to become pregnant with a 2nd child, and they would their story after story, horrific how women were treated and how the baby was aborted and then placed at her side for her to see which quote she had done. I mean, just horrific stories.
Oh my gosh.
And then we would also see that if a child happened to kind of survive the gauntlet between contraception and abortion and survived, you were not even recognized by the state. You had no validity, which meant you received no benefit, no support. I mean, so this is not just, in a sense of some ideology just out there floating around. This is a forced mindset, a forced ideology that now it's come to roost. I mean, it's here.
Did they promote the 1 child thing as a type of social good? Because it does seem interesting that you would have a population that is being told you cannot welcome more than 1 child and having it enforced through such horrific means. If you then turn around and say, hey, you can welcome more children, I would almost think that this quote unquote oppressed people would be very excited to be able to welcome more. But you're saying it's created this culture that's anti-child. Was that because they were basically propagandized into thinking it's a good thing to have 1 child?
Well, even most recent articles have noted, has incentivizing welcoming more children. And let's also put a comma. There is ready access to IVF and reproductive art technologies. They're out there. Okay. So that's not the issue. It's like all of a sudden they don't have this. It's really about the fact that a mindset has been created and that we've actually taught people that larger families are bad. It's not good for society, not good for the culture, not good for the planet, all the various ways that have been used. And now we're all of a sudden trying to tell people, oh, we welcome a child, welcome more children.
I guess my thought is it makes sense for the West where you have like the frog in boiling water, where it's like you've been slowly brainwashed to believe this idea that having one or two children is the norm. I guess I always envision people who are under the thumb of a restrictive government as being more likely to resist, like, I don't know, people in communist Poland keeping the faith alive because they had to underground despite everything versus people in the West kind of having it watered down slowly over time and losing their faith. So I guess I was asking, in China, how was this anti-child culture thriving in that mindset? If they're being so brutal about it, wouldn't that create a pushback on behalf of the people to want to have more children?
Fear is a very powerful tool. And when you would have your own family member or your own neighbor, reporting you to the government and a whole system. So, I mean, this is the system that's created, and I think we have to remember that, the population control, also, as we've seen in recent documents from the Vatican, I mean, has been condemning these practices for decades.
Yeah.
And also the manipulation and a violation of human rights, the rights of parents, the rights of the child, all these things come into bear. And it was used as a political tool. It's used as a governmental tool. It's used as an ideological tool to enforce, to implant, and to instantiate their position. And so now it's not that we have stripped all this away. Right? We're still talking about communist China. We're still talking about a very hands-on government approach. And remember, one of the tenets of the system is that you are work for the state. The state is the primary, thing to be served. And so this is still there. Now we're talking about here about communist China. Now, the other countries have different systems, different approaches, and different ways of implementation of their approach. So, but here, it's a great tool that the government has been able to utilize, but it's come to haunt. It's come back because now when you have invested so much of this in your approach, in your implementation, and in your enforcement, now you're saying to the same people, right? 2 or 3 generations later, we have to change the position here. But it's not so much because we believe in marriage. It's not so much because we believe in the dignity of marriage. We don't believe in the openness and of procreation. The government is still telling you, numbers and who and how and where's the voucher. And of course, people of more means get a little bit more. So government is still very heavy-handed in this. And this is why some of the articles that I've been reading are saying that's why it's not going to work. It doesn't work because you have to get underneath it and reinstill within the heart and minds of people the beauty of marriage. The fruit of marriage, the understanding of marriage. But if the government is still in control of those very institutions, right, which we as a church really state, remember the marriage existed before the state. So the state doesn't have a right to impose these things, but this is what's happened. So specifically in China, and we can also say that in many other communist countries.
No, that makes sense. That it's not like you've gotten out from underneath the control of the state and now you're free to do as you please. It's the state just changing its position on how many children you can welcome.
Right.
So
the state is still in charge.
That makes sense for me. It was just interesting because I always think of, the good values thriving in an underground in an oppressive situation. And I can see why it's different in this case.
And also remember, when you mention Poland, we're talking about a country that is truly rooted in Catholicism and an understanding of the God-givenness of marriage and life. So naturally, it's going to oppose anything that's trying to inflict a different mindset upon it. This is different in countries where the Christian church is small and very much in a minority. That's a very different approach, very different mindset.
That's fair. So the Chinese government is offering families, I believe, vouchers or financial incentives, or are those the same thing?
No, that's changed a little bit.
Okay, so could you explain that, and then we'll move into the IVF discussion.
Well, Colleen, I'm still hearing in articles the term voucher. Okay. But what I'm seeing more of is the incentives. So financial incentives, the ability to provide, I say tax relief, but that's for different countries. But, providing money, offering a certain amount of money, quote, per child. I mean, this is why I go back to
quote unquote bribe for having a child.
But the idea, again, looking at a child again as a thing, that we're going to give you $1,500, we're going to give you $2,000. And so some are giving property. What I understand from my different reading of different articles about the situation is governors in different districts, are kind of given a little freedom from the government, the heads of government, of how to offer incentives because they know the region better, they know the people better. But again, it's still a government down, right? And so I'm seeing different ways of helping. But what's happening is, as you look at the numbers, it really has not made a difference. Remember, we had a podcast on Russia on a similar thing where the patriarch, was through the president and through the patriarch writing to people. And of course, we looked at it from a positive, and that is the patriarch is writing, encouraging couples to be welcomed, open to life, and so forth. But we also know that the government itself was trying to incentivize people, offering property, offering farms, housing, other incentives. But we also saw the same thing, that it really wasn't making the impact that the government had hoped that it would do.
Now, you made it sound like the government giving a financial stipend to a couple that welcomes children as a bad thing because it's treating a child as a commodity. Isn't there a positive benefit to it? Because I know that that's happening in other Western countries as well. Isn't there a positive benefit to helping relieve the financial burden of welcoming a child?
Sure. And of course, we just saw something recently, which I know we're going to get to with regard to the Trump administration's recent executive orders, one in February, one in October. But when you look at this, again, the bishops are saying, yes, we are far, in the sense of looking at incentives. What we mean by that is let's take children out of the equation in a sense of welcoming children. Let's talk about what the role of government is and how it should be exercising, more prudence in how it taxes and levies tax and how it places burden upon the family and upon families. So very different understanding.
Yeah, instead of we're going to give you a financial stipend for having a child, we're going to relieve the financial restrictions that are keeping.
Right.
Yeah, okay.
That's what we want. So that's what we're after. So it's not so much, kind of enticements, as much as, again, changing our approach, changing our understanding.
You don't want a carrot. You want a child-friendly culture.
Right. So how do we promote good schools? How do we promote vouchers for schools? How do we lower taxes? How do we incentivize, in the sense of local government, providing more opportunity for families, by bringing the cost of living down, bringing the cost of housing down, commodities down. These are all things that help a family. And what we notice here in the United States particularly, and Colleen, in some of the Western countries where there's affluency, that couples with a lot of money don't necessarily welcome more children. So that's another problem. Again, almost in a way similar to what China is facing, where it's trying to change people's approach by incentivizing, by giving, stipends and so forth. But yet at the same time, we have a problem in many of the Western countries, of affluent countries, where couples who have the means, who don't need incentive in a sense of vouchers, they don't need stipends, they don't need more money, but they're not welcoming children.
Yeah.
And why? Because the same thing has happened. In the West, secularism and its values have intruded, created its own culture.
Yeah.
And in countries where totalitarian systems are imposing upon families restrictions and so forth, has had actually the same impact. Right? It's scary.
It is really wild to look at the free Western country versus either the old Soviet countries or communist China, and just see how they followed a very similar cultural path when it comes to welcoming children, despite having very different ways that this was implemented.
Exactly.
In the West, it was more covert. It was done through propaganda and changing a culture and changing out people's attitudes, not necessarily in an obvious way, versus imposing very harsh restrictions in the Soviet Union and in China, but yet you end up with the same type of result. And now the governments on all the sides of the aisle are saying, oh, this is a problem, let's reverse it. And they're using the same types of incentives.
That's right. And when you think about the fact of the impact of the contraceptive mentality, what contraception really has done, to every part of the world, whether as a use of propaganda, to implement true population control agendas, or to change literally how people approach marriage and approach family life. The outcomes have resulted the same. We have a universal low birth rate.
Mhm.
And outside of Africa, certain countries of Africa, where it's the only continent that continues to grow in population, though we're starting to see some other in other countries begin to change some of the number. But in the sense, it's why we see Africa at bullseye
Mhm.
from many Western countries trying to impose its own ideologies. This is also scary to me.
Mhm.
As a pro-life leader and having been in many of these countries, is we're dying. We're
Mhm.
literally like a beautiful grape becoming a raisin. We're
Mhm.
shrinking, we're shriveling, but yet, and we know the harm, but now we still want to impose that upon a life-loving, family-loving culture.
Mhm.
So but again, it shows you what evil is, and it shows you what blindness is, and it shows you what happens when we look at the what we've talked about several times, the mindset of the National Security Study Memorandum,
Yeah.
200, which we won't talk about today, but it just shows what happens when we don't see the value and the good, the
Mhm.
intrinsic good of marriage and family life, and want to protect it
Mhm.
and uplift it and help it, to be to flourish and to seek its well-being. But that's not the approach.
Okay, so one thing I want to talk about in response to that is IVF, because this has been the main way that the United States and China and many other countries see as the solution to this birth rate crisis. So in the US, Trump is trying to expand access to IVF, and I believe something similar is happening in China. So could you discuss why these world leaders see IVF as this great gateway to fixing the birth rate crisis, and then why that's not actually a good solution?
Interesting. Some of the articles that I've been reading, particularly in speaking about the United States and about China, as I mentioned earlier, when we talk, so let's kind of separate some of our issues,
Hmm.
right? So first of all, there is a real impact that is happening with young couples who
Hmm.
are struggling with the burden of infertility.
Yes.
So this is a reality that obviously needs to be spoken about and addressed.
I want to say it's on the rise 1% every
Right.
year or something
So
like that.
that's why it's an important question to be asking ourselves: why, and
Hmm.
what can we do morally, ethically, to help facilitate an answer to why this is occurring, and what are the moral means we can help couples to achieve their desired end,
Hmm.
which is a natural outcome of love, and that is the welcoming of children. So
Hmm.
let's put that to the moment.
Yeah.
And one of the articles I recently read was what I mentioned a little earlier. It's not like there is a dearth of IVF treatments around the world. Most of the Western world, many of those in the developing world, have access to this, especially in the
Hmm.
cities. So why we're pushing, and that's why I'm concerned about one area of concern, why all of a sudden we wanted to push IVF as the solution? We're talking about a small percentage of the population
Hmm.
struggling with infertility. As I just mentioned, let's put it aside. So the real issue is, why are people not welcoming children
Hmm.
who, the strongest percentage, are capable
Hmm.
of welcoming children, are not welcoming children? That's the question. IVF is not going to solve that.
Yeah.
That's not the issue. And so what the issue is on the first is what I mentioned in my article, and what I just gave a lecture recently on this topic on the two executive orders. So let's kind of look at that for a second.
Okay.
So as our listeners may be aware of, so in February of 2025, President Trump gave an executive order calling for a review, looking at policies and approachments of how do we address the issue of infertility.
Hmm.
And so he was just asking questions and giving, in a sense, motivation,
Hmm.
and looking for recommendations,
Yeah.
right? And so at the same time wanted to see more openness,
Hmm.
to this so-called treatment
Hmm.
and this process of treatment. And then in October of the same year, he released another executive order where this time he expresses a partnership with a particular pharmaceutical company,
Hmm.
where now they want to see the lowering of cost, and also look at how, not mandating, but how insurance can be used and so forth. So when you look at this again, is why not look at how do we talk about what we talk about which is restorative reproductive medicine,
Yeah.
which gets to the underlying issues of what may be causing infertility.
Because my understanding is that the whole idea of expanding access to IVF is based in this idea that it's very expensive. Let's make it more affordable. But my other understanding is that restorative reproductive medicine is inherently not as expensive as IVF. So why don't we expand
Right.
access to this and expand awareness of this? Since it is moral, it is ethical, it's not going to cost people as much, and it's more effective because it solves the underlying issue.
Part of it is, without it sound, is the fact that we're talking about a massive industry. Right. The in vitro fertilization industry is massive, and it's supported by many industries who depend on it and thrive on it. And sadly, again, this is, as we know, as I mentioned in our most recent article, people approach IVF for different reasons. Right. Some people approach the use of in vitro fertilization, because they're struggling with infertility. That's what they look towards. It's a reproductive technology among many ways of approach. It's the most successful, and practitioners tend to focus on it the most. One, because its outcomes tend to be a little bit higher in percentage of positive outcomes, pregnancy, but it's also very expensive and requires multiple visits and so forth. There's a lot of resource involved. The second thing, that's interesting is that people who approach IVF are not necessarily married. You have single people, who want to be parents. And so you have also people who are married, but don't want to, women who don't want to carry a child, if I may use that horrible term, carry. But so what they do is they hire through IVF. They then get into surrogacy, a whole other subject, okay? Because they don't want to deal with the stretch marks. They don't want to deal with the inconvenience and so forth. Or because people are marrying a little later in life and not able to achieve pregnancy, all right? So there's lots of things happening here. So, but again, and then we have also those within the same-sex community.
Yes.
Right. So there are many reasons why people approach this particular reproductive process, to help them to achieve the outcome of pregnancy. And so we can't ignore that. But again, we're still talking about a small percentage. So we have a larger percentage of people who are very much have the potential of welcoming children that are not pursuing this natural end. But contraceptive continue to be utilized. A high percentage of Catholics, sadly, employ contraception in their marriage, violating the ends of marriage. So these are the kind of things that are not being spoken of. And that's why we're not going to achieve what either President Trump and his administration or the leadership in China and many other governments by looking at a particular small aspect. But we need to get to the underlying part, and that is, why are people not welcoming children? What are those reasons?
Now, I want to get to that, but could you just let our audience know what China is doing regarding IVF? Because I believe that's one of the things they're also trying to expand as well, right?
That's correct. So, and again, it's when you look at this, it's in a sense, the government is giving incentives, whether that be through lowering the cost of the procedure, helping with insurance, and whatever those incentives are. It's again looking at trying to grow their demography. And it's not going to happen. All the studies show it's not going to have the change that they think it's going to be. So just for our listeners, 7 years now, 6 to 7 years, the United States has been below replacement level. This year we crept down even more from 1.7 to 1.6. IVF and access to IVF is not going to solve that.
No.
Right.
I think it's so interesting that you have these two massive world powers, both of whom are experiencing a birth rate crisis for different reasons. China imposed it. The U.S. sort of imposed it through propaganda. That gets into the whole Kissinger report and things like that. But basically, it was a little bit more of a frog in boiling water in the United States. Now, they both hit a birth rate crisis. Now they're trying to reverse it, and they're both using the same things, which is financial incentives and expanding access to IVF. So here's my question for you. You're saying that we have to get under the underlying reasons that couples aren't welcoming children. Do you think those reasons are the same in both the United States and China, or do you think they're different?
So if I return back to Poland, as you mentioned earlier, so as Catholics and as Christians, we look at marriage and view family life very differently than secular society, the state. So our approach to marriage is we see what marriage truly is. We see the value in the good that resides within marriage, that God has created, the God-givenness the fidelity, the exclusivity, and the fruitfulness of that union, of which Pope Leo has also been talking about, because he's also been talking about low birth rates, And so when you look at this is what as our approach. And so if we value the beauty of marriage and we value the beauty of the fruit of conjugal love, the begetting and welcoming and engendering of children, then that's a very different view than trying to have a government trying to kind of create a kind of a tsunami, if you will, of all of a sudden everyone's just going to wake up and we're going to all want to have children.
So basically both China and the United States are suffering from a basically misconception of marriage, even though that might have been imposed through different means.
And both are looking at it even in that differently. So here, what we're saying is that the desire, with President Trump, for example, in administration, at his face value, there is a good, the desire for welcoming of children, right? But what are our moral principles? The end does not justify the means, right? So and nothing's going to change that. You can't do something immoral in order to accomplish this great good that you're trying to. So the desire, same thing for a couple struggling with infertility. What does the church say? First of all, we love you. We are here. We walk with you. We understand that this is a tremendous burden. In the same time, we know that the natural desire of your love is the welcoming of children, and we want that desire to be fulfilled. But there are means that are never permissible to achieve that end. But there are means that are available that are not being talked about. And this is, again, what the bishops have been talking about with regard to the recent October executive order, is why are we not looking at, restorative reproductive medicine, which, like for us, would be, we've talked about natural technology. There's many that are within the church's teaching that fulfill the moral principles, that assist couples in achieving the natural end of conjugal love versus replace them. So just for our listeners, just to recap this, so in vitro fertilization, this is just one of the reproductive technologies that are there, all right? This one is immoral, never permissible. Why? So first of all, it violates a number of goods. Bishop Burbage here in the Diocese of Arlington wrote a beautiful, pastoral in response to the recent executive order, because, he recognizes it harms marriage, couples, and it harms children. In IVF, what happens? So the egg is taken from the woman, sperm is collected from the man. Let's just say in this situation, we're not talking about donors. Let's say it's a husband and wife, right? So the sperm is usually collected by an act of masturbation, again, never permissible. But then they're brought into a laboratory in a lab environment. In vitro means glass. Right? That's why it's used this way. In vitro fertilization. Fertilization occurs in glass, in a petri dish, in glass. So egg and sperm are brought together not by an act of husband and wife, not by conjugal love, the sexual act, but by a technician. That same technician now, because not just one egg is fertilized, multiple eggs are fertilized. So in often cases, the woman's ovaries are overstimulated to produce multiple eggs. They are collected, placed, and all of them are fertilized. Then that same lab technician will then, in a kind of almost in an act of eugenics, will begin to arbitrarily decide which has value, which does not, which one can we implant. So what happens is not only have we violated the good of marriage, right? But now we violated the right of a child to be conceived in the act of their mother and father, called conjugal love, all right? And so in this moment, now the child is at the hands of an arbitrary person outside of that act. So now we brought other people into this conversation, into something that is supposed to be sacred between husband and wife. That's been violated. And now, if the child in this particular new conceived embryonic life is perceived to have any type of genetic abnormality, what happens to this little new life? This is a human being, right? They are either discarded, which means they're destroyed, so murdered. Number two, or they're put into a cryopreservation, so frozen, or they're given to a laboratory for experimentation. So millions and millions of little boys and girls are destroyed, violated, their rights are undermined. So IVF has so many ethical problems. It is reek with issues.
One thing that struck me as we were preparing for this episode, because I was thinking about China, the old one-child policy, and the gender imbalance that resulted because of that, because girls were often aborted because families wanted to have a son because a son was, I think, prestigious, and that's who like will take care of you when you're older. And there was a bunch of social reasons for that. And it struck me that in expanding access to IVF, you're actually just making it easier to do this sex selection because you can only choose to implant the
Correct.
embryos
Right.
that are boys. And so it was just an interesting point of like, this has already been a problem in China, and maybe it'll stop being a problem if couples are welcoming 2 or more children. But it was just something interesting that I thought about.
Right. And as you said earlier, I mean, I said, that's why I want to try to separate the issues, because there is a pastoral response that the church has in helping couples who are struggling with infertility.
Yeah.
That is present. It's unfortunately just not being taught. It's not being followed up on, and we're not speaking about the issues with our couples. And this is something that we as a church need to address.
Then correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems like the governments are trying to expand access to IVF because they think that the reason that people aren't having children is because they're struggling with infertility. Is that seeming to be the logic behind this?
That's the impression when you read several of the articles, and that's what makes this, this makes it so suspect, because, what is given the impression, especially when we know the percentage, we can look at the studies and understand what percentage of the population of childbearing years are struggling with infertility. And as you said, there is a growing, and that's why we have to understand what is causing this, what's leading to
that
this.
That definitely has to be addressed. But it seems like your argument then is that, well, obviously expanding access to IVF is always immoral, but also it's not going to fix the birth rate crisis, because the largest percentage of this crisis is coming because couples who have the ability to welcome children, or young people who have the ability to get married and welcome children, aren't doing it.
And also, the IVF does not resolve infertility.
Well,
you still have not resolved the reason why they're infertile. So you really have not done anything here to address the issue of infertility. That's why I want to try to keep that area, the topic, as we address it, say separate, as it relates to what we're talking about, is being promoted as some great answer, some great good, and it's not. All right. And this is why
it's related, but not the primary issue.
It's basically. And so the primary issue here, what we would say to the president, and this is being said, on the issue of couples struggling with infertility, let's look at the underlying reasons, the systemic reasons, through a beautiful RRMs, restorative reproductive medicines. Let's invest there. Because what's happening, many practitioners in reproductive technologies, even the best of intended, people of good moral stature, who want to pursue the moral, but the incentive is there's not enough resource, not enough data, not enough scientific research, not enough grants. So where did the money come? Well, we're going to put it in IVF. So where do you think most are going to turn? They're not going to turn toward the moral way of approachment, which protects marriage, protects the good of marriage, protects the rights of children, and prevents children from being commercialized and commodified, right? And I think what often upsets people is the church's, stand, which is a child is a gift. No one has a right to a child. And so here, even with the president, is as we hear some pro-life language, we hear some life protections, but then we have this, which really undermines the protection of human life. And so we have to really have people raise these issues with our president.
So that deals with the percentage of people who are not welcoming children because they're struggling with infertility. Is there anything that can be done to change the mindset of the broader culture where people aren't welcoming children because they have this anti-child mindset? Or is that something that the government can't do at all, and it's up to us of the church, up to the laity, to really be the ones doing the legwork to change that mindset?
It really is about formation. It's about recatechizing. And it's also continuing to hold up this great good. Interesting, Pope Leo has been very much since being elected successor of St. Peter, that he's been focusing on the family. He's been focusing in heavily on marriage and the family.
And this is the area that financial incentives are targeting. So the financial incentives target the group that isn't welcoming children because they don't seem to want to. IVF is supposed to help target the group that's struggling with infertility. Okay.
Yeah.
So then if the financial ones aren't working for that larger group, then there has to be an actual mindset shift.
You have to really shift the mindset, and that is, I mean, we don't approach this from a financial point. Obviously, we're not approaching this from a financial gain.
Financial things do weigh into whether or not a couple welcomes a children, so or welcomes a child. So it does make sense that would be at least part of the discussion.
But it's a small percentage in many ways, because as I mentioned earlier, when you look at the studies of people of means, I mean, today, the potential for you and your husband to make a better income than your own parents, to have more, is there. I mean, many of generations today actually are doing far better than their own parents' generations.
There is a lot of debt among young people, though. It's not just the numbers of how much people are making.
But when you look at those who have means, they're not welcoming children. And so it's not that's preventing them. It's not necessarily, that's not the standalone reason. It's really that, when you look at generations now of people who have been indoctrinated and inculcated in a mindset.
Okay, so I haven't done that much research into it, but apparently studies exist showing that especially young people want more children than they're actually welcoming. What do you think is driving that then? If people want to have 3 or 4 children and they're only welcoming 1 or 2 and it's not financial, what do you think is driving that?
So we've written on this several times. Fear is a big issue, because it's also the fear of the cost. It's a fear of changing one's lifestyle. It's a fear of the unknowns. It could be fear of financial responsibility. All this thing flows, in fear. That's why it's not necessarily, especially again for us, we approach marriage and family as a vocation, as a meaningful. It has a purpose. It's sacrificial love. It's prioritizing values, versus in a sense of monetizing things. We don't monetize the family, but this is how society acts. But we don't do that. And so at the same time, what you mentioned is very valid, and that is there are considerations that are always involved. Absolutely. And so, but in the idea, because the child also has a right, to be welcomed in a home where there will be those basic things that a child needs, shelter, food, clothing.
Well, I was going to say that was the most convincing response to that I've heard. I think it was Brett Cooper. I think I mentioned this on a previous podcast, but she was saying that the reason for that is a lot of people want to welcome a larger number of children than they're actually doing, but they want to do it within marriage, which is good. But then they're waiting longer and longer to get married for various reasons. And then once they do get married, they're only able to biologically welcome a smaller number. She was arguing that the solution is to fix the marriage crisis. And I think that does seem to make those two facts make sense, that you have young people who want to welcome more children. And why aren't they?
And some of the largest expenses that any family, any part of the world will face is their home, vehicles, transportation. So this is again where government can and should play an important role. How do we bring the cost of living down? How do we again lower the ability of taxes? Instead of taking more from families, how can we invest more in our families? How do we do all that? So all the things that are being attempted is, in a sense, we want is people to come to the table like we're doing today, and let's talk this through. What will IVF really do to change this? Very, very little. Right? It's not going to change the demographic numbers. If it does, it's going to be minimal. We've already have examples of it. What will change the needle is when we change our focus, when we change our understanding of these great goods. And it's not for government to do, right? It's the role it is a collaborative work. That is the role of religion, the role of families. This is what you learn from your moms, your dads, your grandparents, your great-grandfathers, your great-grandmothers. And government is there to assist, not to impose, not to undermine, right? And let's be honest, for several decades, this government in the United States, along with every other Western nation, has imposed population control mentality.
Yeah, they've just done it differently.
Differently, exactly. We have created this problem. We have sustained the problem, and now it's come to the forefront, and there's no ignoring it.
It's interesting, as we were talking, something just occurred to me that hadn't before, and that is that the two primary solutions that governments seem to be bringing up to this issue are both IVF and here's a financial incentive to welcome a child. And both of those seem like Band-Aid solutions that don't fix the underlying problem. IVF doesn't actually fix the infertility problem. Reproductive restorative medicine would. giving people a stipend for welcoming a child could help a little bit, but it doesn't fix the underlying economic
Right.
social climate that people aren't choosing to welcome
Right.
children in. So instead of Band-Aid solutions, we need to start looking at what actually can we do to
Right.
heal this underlying
Exactly.
issue.
Well, let me give you an example of that, and that is, I'm not going to use names,
Mhm.
but it's a couple I know who have
Mhm.
welcomed 7 children.
Okay.
Right? They come from a country that would consider this a horrific crime.
Mm.
Right? They live in another country that has sadly suffered from low birth rates,
Mhm.
right? And so and it's a Western country. These are both Western countries,
Mhm.
and so when they're in the country they currently live in and work in, people are enthralled to see all these kids, and they're still amazed. But there's an excitement. They love
Mhm.
seeing them. They're like, and especially older people and people in their middle, how do you do this? They're
Mhm.
asking questions, but they're intrigued.
Mhm.
They go home to where they were both born
Mhm.
and they get ridiculed,
Wow.
openly ridiculed,
Yeah.
right? So this is what we're talking about here.
Yeah.
So you have two countries that still have the same result. Their demography numbers are equal,
Mhm.
right? But one has been strongly intrusive in the sense of it's vile. I mean, on buses, trains, grocery stores, and the stories I hear, I told them, Mom and Dad, you're stronger people than me because
Mhm.
I would want to pull their tonsils out. I mean, he's just in the sense of they insult the children. It's one thing to insult an adult, but then you return to the other country and people are just playing with them. They talk to them. But both have ended with the same problem.
Mhm.
So one actually, I believe, can be reconciled probably more easily
Mhm.
because there is an intrigue, there's an openness, there's a
Mhm.
kind of there's a value there that they once treasured,
Mhm.
both treasured, but this one still has that underlying current they
Mhm.
love. The other will be more difficult because it has a very different mindset.
Mhm.
So that's why the role of the church, the
Mhm.
role of the Christian community, the role of the Jewish community, because we have many Jewish pro-life and family leaders that are working in this issue of demography, trying to change the equation, trying to change the direction. So we have to work with our younger generations. We
Mhm.
have to intentionally reach out to them. And there is great disappointment when you read the studies. The current generation that's coming into young adulthood is very disappointed in what they're seeing.
Yep.
They're anxious, but they're disappointed.
Mhm.
They're looking for solutions. They're looking for a path forward. And what you said is very true. They recognize a good,
Mhm.
but to achieve that good seems unobtainable in the current way.
Yeah.
So here is an opportunity in front of us, which is why these young people are being drawn to more structured community life. They're
Mhm.
being drawn, even within religion, to more. And I don't like using terms, but in
Mhm.
the sense of a more tradition,
Mhm.
in the sense of wanting that structure,
Mhm.
looking for the sacred, looking for the beautiful, looking for the good. They're
Yeah.
looking for answers. They're not looking for, just Band-Aids. They're not looking
Mhm.
for, just cover the surface. They're looking.
Yeah.
The church has the answer. She always has, right? And the solution is what Pope Leo is saying. But it's interesting, Colleen, Pope Leo is made reference to, and I've been made reference to several times, to Zélie and Louise Martin.
Mhm.
So he's saying, when you look at that culture of that family, there's something within that culture that
Mhm.
created this wondrous family of holiness, and the world has lost sight of that.
Mhm.
And many of our young people, today are coming from wounded situations. They're coming from broken homes. They're coming from environments that are not the Zélie and Louise, Saint
Mhm.
Therese of Lisieux. That's not. So Pope Leo is saying we have to elevate
Oh,
this.
for sure. I mean, I grew up in a really great home, and yet I still recognize how the experiences of extended family members and
Right.
other people that we knew growing up affected my ability to fears that I had when I was in dating and going into marriage and all of
Right.
that. It was just if I experienced those wounds growing up in the home that I did, I know that people
Right.
who grew up in
Right.
more broken environments or in broken environments in general, what they're carrying. And so
Right.
that's one reason I'm very passionate about the young people growing up 2 or 3 generations down
Right.
from the sexual revolution, because
Right.
know how hard it is to try to make that leap into marriage when you have seen so much disintegrate around you?
Well, I think, as I've written several times, recently I was giving a lecture for a seminar, and in the Q&A, there was the question, because one of the key segments of my presentation was the role of government. And so government, as we're talking today, I don't want people to think that government doesn't have a role. The church makes it very beautiful in her teaching. The government does have a role, has a responsibility, for the common good, for the well-being of its citizens. And so, but how do we, address this? So I was recently just asked a question about that, and that's what so what would be, in a sense, not say a solution, take the word out. What would be a path forward? Well, it would be, for religious leaders who share this same understanding and approach to sit with civil leaders, who are family members, who are sons and daughters, husbands and wives, and talk this out. How can we help each other?
Well, it sounds like from what you're saying too, the role of government is to create the external structure that allows something to thrive. So like the government should make the trellis that the vine can climb up, but like the government isn't making the vine grow. The government is like, it's not the vine. The government is providing the external structure needed to be able to allow the family to flourish and to grow.
So what we have, principle of subsidiarity, we have the principle of stewardship, and we have a principle of common good. So these are all there. And this is where the church has tremendous wisdom of 2,000 years of experience, has lived through many situations throughout this millennia to bring to the table. Government has a place to play, and you just explained so beautifully, and that is its role is, it's almost what, as Pope Leo has been calling, the cradle of humanity, the family. So what is the role of government? Is to make sure that that cradle is protected. It's in its own interest. So what I would say in the conversation we've been having, in the discussion, is that sitting down with the Trump administration and separating these issues, there is a legitimate need, a responsible need to address the reasons why infertility is happening and why is it growing.
And how to do that morally.
And how to approach it ethically, through the means that respect marriage, respect the ends of marriage, and respect the beauty of children and not commodify children. There is a means forward. And we've been talking about, restorative reproductive medicine. So that's very important. That needs to be talked about more and actually encouraged. And that's where grants, that's where incentivizing can be, that's where the government plays a key role, putting money in that, giving grants to, to researchers and research institutes who are ethically and morally approaching these subjects. That's one. Second thing is sitting down with government leaders and finding what are the ways in which we can to restore an understanding, that the government needs to protect these great goods of marriage. So we have to talk about, honestly, we have in the United States, what do we have? We have divorce rates. All right. And so we have issues of separation. We have abandonment. So I remember this, and I know our time is running short today, but we don't have time. But I remember, coming from the state of Louisiana, where I was working with other pro-life leaders, both Catholic, Christian community, even the Jewish community. And one of the things we realized is that so much about the family has been lost. And so the religious leaders, because the government was looking at, hey, you religious leaders come in here because we have crime rates growing, we have the broken family, we have poor education standards or percentages, all the things that are there, okay, didn't just happen. Nothing happens in a vacuum. So they're looking toward the religious leaders to help them address these fundamental issues. And this is where there is a collaboration of responsibility. And so it's in society's best interest that we start speaking a language that really advocates for the family. And what is the family, right? So we have to protect marriage between one man and one woman, right? In an indissoluble, exclusive, fruitful union. We have to do that, which is not the narrative the world wants to hear, right? And we also know that, there are people promoting other ideologies. Well, these have been fundamentally harmful to society, right? And one day, as we're seeing now, they will see that result. You cannot continue to promote these false understandings of human sexuality and thrive. Will not.
So
The
true.
reason why we're in this problem is because we have fundamentally undermined an understanding of human sexuality, of the human person. And as a result, here we are.
So true.
So to restore it, we have to return back.
Yeah.
And it's not nostalgia. I'm not looking to go back to the age of other than the simplicity, the love, the value of centuries before. My great-grandparents, who I knew, and how they lived, or my grandparents, so, but there is much to learn from them. That, what does Scripture say? And maybe this is the best way for me to end, would be the Lord's first commandment, was to be fruitful. The second that we hear was to pass it on. So, that I'm the Lord your God, I'm the Lord alone, right? Deuteronomy chapter 6, verses 4-7. And to teach this to your children and your children's children and every generation. Let's be honest, especially in many of our Christian countries and Catholic populations, we have not done a very good job of this. And so as a result, it's come to haunt us. It's come to show us the consequence of our decisions.
Yeah.
And so with that said, it can be turned around, right? And so I would just say that's something maybe you and I can pick up again later and talk a little bit more in detail. But I'm going to end by, anyone listening in the current administration, IVF is not the answer. It's not the answer for couples struggling with infertility. It's not the answer for demographics. It's not going to change the low birth rate numbers that they're thinking they're going to achieve. And it's not going to change the breakdown of the family that we see in our culture. And it's not going to heal our nation.
Yeah.
Not. So let's find the right reason.
Amen. Well, thank you so much, Father. This has been a really interesting episode, just looking at the problems that China is facing and how they got there, the problems how the U.S. is facing and how they're very similar despite having very different paths here, and then just the different solutions that have been proposed and the pros and cons, and obviously all cons in IVF's case. So thank you so much for this.
I'll look forward to coming back with you. I know we're going to have many more opportunities.
Oh, I'm sure we will. And to all of our audience, please like and subscribe. If you're listening on our audio platforms, please leave us a 5-star review and keep on living the culture of life. God bless.